Hello and welcome to Poetry at the Lexicon. Thank you for coming, and thanks to DLR Libraries, Arts Office and Creative Ireland for supporting these readings. I'm so happy to be able to consistently invite some of the most accomplished and excited poets to read here with us. Today we'll be hearing from Sara Berkeley, Brennan and Jo Clement. These are poets who look at the power of poetry and of art more generally to shape our perceptions of the world. Their influences range from the 18th century printmaker Thomas Bewick to Mexican grief songs and engage the history of colonialism. Through the upending influence of COVID, these poets look at the meaning of home as shaped by otherness and displacement. Though always aware of the threats of loss and violence, this work is also infused with magic and natural beauty that allows us to witness the joy and strangeness of being alive. So I'm delighted they're here with us today. I'm going to introduce each poet to you before they read, and then they'll read for around 15 minutes. The event is captioned, and you can turn on captions by using the button to the bottom of the video. So first, we're going to hear from Sara Berkeley. Sara Berkeley grew up in Ireland and spent many years in the San Francisco Bay Area. She now lives in New York's Hudson Valley, where she works as a hospice nurse. She has had 7 collections of poetry published, as well as a novel and a collection of short stories. Her poetry has been widely anthologized, and her most recent collection, The Last Cold Day, won the 2023 inaugural Yeats Society Sligo Poetry Prize. It charts a move across America from one climate to 4 seasons and the constant threat of climate disaster. The ice, she says, sings its last song, a requiem. She draws from her own experiences of working at the front lines of the epidemic to show us the great changes we face and the lessons we learn from loss. So I'm thrilled Sara could be with us today. Welcome, Sara.
Thanks, it's really great to be here and an honour to read alongside Dylan and Jo. Mostly I'm going to be reading poems from The Last Cold Day today. My poetry tends to be deeply personal, and since climate change seems the most personal issue of all, it's been working its way into my poems over the last few years. So I'll start with the first poem in the book called Oakjacull. It is written about CNN in 2019 said that there was going to be a plaque memorializing the first Icelandic glacier that was lost to climate change. Oakjacull. The ice sings beneath the glacier's weight. I wake at 5 and there's no going back to the dream state, only forward through the tall gates of the day. The past piles up. The memories of fires send up their smoky prayers. I cannot make them stop. We need rain to drown out the threat of burn. The hills beneath their tinder beards are blanched white-brown. Burned up, we call it, though there are no flames. It's a slow burn that has been going down for decades now. I'm trying to understand what keeps us safe, what stands between us and harm. The ice sings its long last song, a requiem, nothing between us and harm. In the amped up nights, they come for me from the shadows with their long knives. I ride out before the dawn to open wide the gates of my life. I ride through the open gates, and the dark that kept me sharp is still alive. It speaks to me in tongues, but I feel it getting thinner and the singing running drier. Oakjacull has drowned beneath the weight of our desires, our failures of resolve, of courage, and our deafness to a calling that goes higher and higher till the ice melts to fire. Sometimes people ask me what my poems are about, and I always have difficulty because every poem is a weaving of many things. The next poem is an example of this. It's called Kincaid Fire, and it's about the fire that happened in 2019 in California when I was living there in Sonoma County. But it also weaves in a lot of influence from art, from looking at paintings and sculpture. Kincaid Fire. How little we know of any hour beyond this hour. The backdrop to everything is joy. The backdrop to everything is horror. Wind shakes the redwood rain free of the trees, a natural stripping down of the leaves, a natural catastrophic fanning of the flames. There is no limit to the elements of art. Lead, earth, oil, straw, seeds. Etched polished glass, paper pins, hand-wrought, copper gold paint. These are the things we wrap around ourselves when we are hurt. The backdrop to everything is love. The backdrop to everything is fear. 3-color sugar lift and photogravure. Everything we'll ever need is here. Steel, plaster, wedding dress, razor wire. How little we know of any hour beyond this hour. The absolution of every forest is fire. Well, by day, when I'm not writing poems about death, I'm a hospice nurse. And as you can imagine, I meet a lot of people at a very intense and sacred time in their lives. And there's a lot of stories. There's things you couldn't make up. So I find the stories of these people also working their way into my poetry. And it feels like the suffering that I witness all day long, which can be very intense and heavy, ends up having some kind of meaning for me when I can write about it. So this is a short story about a man I took care of. And at the end of his life, he resisted having a hospital bed or any of the trappings. But the last night, he agreed to a hospital bed. And it finally arrived. He got into it and he died that night. But before he died, he called out to his wife, and she was in their bedroom. And she came in and she got in the bed with him. And afterwards, when she told me this story, she said it was like their last date. Last date. Snow finds me in my own form of silence. Drift of words. Add some layers, grey, blue, 2-note bird calls. Roads white from salt, creek running on in tea light, whole of the day flowing by. He called to his wife from the other room. She climbed in his hospital bed with him. We flicker like lights. We go out like stars. Just the one bird now, holding an impossibly high note and the sorrowful comfort of trees. And this one about a woman I used to visit. She lived in a trailer park. There was a lot of poverty around, but the families were really strong. And that was what was important. This is called Wood Thrush. And in it, there's also a lot of influence from the Hudson Valley New England fall, which was new for me when I moved from California, which has very muted, subtle seasons. I moved to a place with very dramatically different seasons. I'd never been in the New England fall before, and it's as stunning every year as it's made out to be. Wood Thrush. Where I turn at the long barn, it's still good. Beyond the creek and mill hook, past the deserted summer camp, the road goes inward to a weary place, somewhere damage was done. My business is at the trailer park. Outside they're double wide, bucket chairs, a fridge, bikes scattered on the rutted road, kids all inside. My visit bears witness to generational pain. I take it in by listening, by feel. The suffering finds a place in me. I drive home through the flutter of scintillant gold leaf, scatter of chipmunk and squirrel. An October so warm, cicadas still flex their timbals. Slowly over the miles, I empty out, and into my hollowed out self pours a 2-note song. Wood thrush, rise and fall, simultaneously sung. Some of the things I've seen still have a beat inside me. Suffering of the dying, counterweight of trees aflame. pull of tide by the moon, sandhill cranes against dream. So, as Rosamund mentioned, in 2020, I took part in a huge migration from San Francisco over to New York, partly due to COVID. So we like to call ourselves COVID migrants, but there were a lot of other factors too. And it was a very unplanned move. So it was dramatic and took a while to really feel at home here in any way, since I've never been here before. Everything was completely new to me. But I found that 5 months after I came, because of COVID, I'd been separated from my daughter, who I'd lived with before I came here. She was 19, and she came to visit finally in January of 2021. And for me, that was a turning point, because showing her my new home and my new state, and we were in snow, which was new for her too, was definitely a turning point in me feeling like I was more at home here. Turning point. It wasn't the longest dark, solar midnight, equidistant from dusk and dawn, when the aching stopped. And it wasn't the moment I buried winter's faint heart in the freezing soil, patting it down, hoping against hope. Or the unknown, unmarked nanosecond when our sun burned halfway through her brief candle. It was the giddy embrace on the curb in the standing lane at JFK. A moment that drew us both into a thin sliver of time outside our lives. The world around us, cold and broken in her turning, permitted us our burning. After 5 months apart, binary stars, blew hot to our inner layers, opened everything. We drove east through the penitence. Snowfields shone in the dark. We raced the moon, forging our lives from the available materials. I felt a gravitational shift from grief and loss. And in the passenger seat, my daughter, blazing under her own power, took the dark and struck it against the air until the air danced with streamers of light. I'd like to read a more recent poem now. I've been writing a lot about my father's death, a very pivotal experience in anyone's life. He died at the end of January in Dublin, and I made a few visits home, during the time that he was dying. It was a very intense, beautiful, sad time. And after he died, I went home to his house one last time to help clear it out. Also a very intense experience that I'm sure a lot of people have been through. And I took a few of his things, and I only allowed myself one suitcase, so I had to be very judicious about what I chose. And one of the things I chose was his slide rule. So this poem's called Slide Rule. This was the first spring, grass holding up under the weight of rain, trees quivering in their lacy underthings. The nights flamed on. In the festival of darkness, I dreamed my dad young. He held my 6-year-old hand on that path around Howth Head. Smoulder of gorse, torch of the ancient sun, a wrinkled pewter skin on the Irish Sea. All the light that left him. I carried his key halfway around the world. Of all our adventures, this was the bravest. I put his key in the door, gave myself over to the silence, more layers, and then more of silence. I put his shirts in a plastic sack, sweaters and shoes in a sack, his socks. I kept one pair. I kept his soft knit black cap and his worn slide rule. University of Dublin, Civil Engineering School, 1952. Across the road, the neighbour's cherry blossom glowed all night, alabaster. Every tree has its perfect moment. In his room, I sat on his bed, and I dreamed him alive as I followed him dead ahead of me on the path, walking strong and free, away from me. I think I have time for maybe one or two more, maybe one. I'd like to read a poem about monarch butterflies. Again, it's influenced by climate change because the monarch's migration pattern is really changing, but they're a kind of a success story in that they were very low numbers for a number of years. Everyone was terribly worried about them. And then for unknown reasons, their numbers burgeoned and they're very healthy at the moment. So I thought I'd try and inject a little optimism into the events. This is called Monarchs, and I wrote it after a trip I took with my daughter in the Florida Keys, which are very endangered themselves. Sunset. After sunset, the barest glow. Dawn after dawn rolls in on the Miami shore's milky air. That's not rain on the radar. That's monarchs riding a cold front south. I'm flying north, forward in time from tropical to where the colors are starting to sing themselves into being. This morning, I walked out in warm rain with my daughter on the Keys. 20 years, 3 months, 14 days. Not that I'm counting. Flights delayed 5 hours, storm in New York. Poor humans. We are trying so hard, but time is contracting. The future keeps getting shorter. We barter. It doesn't matter. I'm watching a man with his sleeping son. Dear, honest, adoring dad, I'm sorry about your baby's sold-out dreams. 30 years will drown the Keys. There is no money to raise the roads, or the grocery stores, or the schools. Hold on tight. Hold on tighter. The rafts they're sending just keep getting lighter. Monarchs' migrating wings sound like waterfalls. 3,000 miles and 5 generations, sailing the hopeful winds to central Mexico in the spring. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was so beautiful. And it's so special to hear you read in this space with just the three of us right now. So next we're planning to hear from Dylan Brennan. Dividing his time between Mexico and Ireland, Dylan Brennan writes poetry and prose. He is a recipient of the Ireland Chair of Poetry Bursary Award. In 2022, he won the inaugural Drumshanbo Written Word Weekend Poetry Film Award for 4 attempts at making a human, a poetry film in collaboration with Jonathan Brennan. He has read at literary festivals in Colombia, Nicaragua, Mexico, Italy, Ireland, and the USA, and has twice been recipient of a Culture Ireland travel grant. Of his second collection, Let the Dead, Elaine Ní Chuilleanáin said, he writes on the borders of life and of death, on the frontiers of cultures, in poems shot full of colour and obliquely illuminated. Using the topographies of Ireland and Mexico and their shared history of colonialism as a background for vibrant, urgent poems about love, miscarriage, childbirth, and death, Brennan interrogates the artist's responsibilities in a time of violence. So I'm thrilled that you could join us today, Dylan, and a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read from my most recent book, Let the Dead, and I decided I'm going to read the first 5 poems, and if there's time, something else. And what is my heart? And a woman said, my breasts are milkless, my eyes are damp, my skeleton is frail, it rattles. And what I want is this. I want you to kill me now instead. And another woman said, what am I without my child, and what is my heart? From this day till the last, a cold clot of blood. That poem is based on an old Irish poem called The Mother's Lament at the Slaughter of the Innocents, and in translation by Kuno Meyer. And I wrote it a good few years ago, and I read it first in Nicaragua, and someone came up to me in the street and said, "Thank you for writing about the mothers of the desaparecidos in Central America." And I thought, well, actually, I wrote this poem about some recently disappeared teachers from Ayotzinapa in Mexico. And then when I read it in Ireland, someone thought it was about Irish instances of mothers having their children ripped away from them. So unfortunately, it's a poem that seems to fit different locations and times and still seem relevant in some way. The next poem I'm going to read is called Bog Cotton. Only hours before the spotting began, we took a walk in the sun and bluster along the northernmost part of our island country, and saw the only clouds were the ankle-high tufts that marked out for us, like a warning, the softest turf. Common cotton sedge or bog cotton. I picked some and so disrupted, destroyed any moffetous potential on that windiest hill brow. Days later now, on the other side of the Atlantic, in our tiny apartment on what were once the shores of a lake island, the dried flowers spill out from my wallet as I look for a phone number. I hold a perianth up to the morning light and drink hot coffee while you sleep. I place a fragile whiteness on a windowsill saucer by the cacti and succulents to be blown out, carried when the rains come. I'm going to read a poem called Kingfisher High Bun. There's a kingfisher on the wall there behind me. But it's based on a guy called Gerald of Wales, or Geraldus Cambrensis, and his book, The Topography of Ireland, or Topographia Hibernica. And he sort of traveled around a little bit of Ireland, not as much as he seems to have claimed, and came up with lots of very interesting stories, most of them nonsense. And I think the aim of the book was partially to portray the Irish as, sort of somewhat depraved and backward. But some of the stories are just fascinating. So there's one where he mentions that a legend that if you keep a kingfisher, a dead kingfisher, if you keep it dry, it can be used to preserve your clothes in your wardrobe and keep your clothes smelling nice. And so I just used that as a springboard for my imagination, and I came up with this Kingfisher High Bun. My kingfisher died. I couldn't bear to see him rot. So I followed the wisdom of the day and kept him dry, placed him in a box. I stuffed the box into my wardrobe. It sat there for years behind grey banks of old jeans with turned up hems where dust, soil, shards of twigs accumulated. You see, if you keep the corpse of a kingfisher in a dry condition, it will never decay. If placed in a wardrobe among garments, the halcyon bird will ward off moths and preserve your clothes with its pleasant odour. I thought often of adorning his resting place with hydrangea petals or a sprig of eyebright, but was worried about moisture, and so left his box as it had always been, a drab, brown geometry. I would sometimes forget he was there until catching a whiff of that fragrance from the corner, like a wicker basket of springtime blossoms from the riverbank. A meandering nosegay that could reach as far as the breakfast table and mingle with the steam from my coffee. I would take him out to show visitors who marveled at his colours, the front plumage like the setting sun on a rusting trawler, and a turquoise glimmer of the sea. All this, to what end? When he was alive, he would land on my wrist and eat the aquatic insects I gathered for him. He once even let me tighten my fingers around his breast to feel the soft mania of his beating heart. And we existed together so very close to the fresh water. Now he is cold and not living, and I'm down here with a tiny raft I've fashioned from discarded fish bones, twine, and dental floss. I place him on the bone craft and kiss him goodbye, push him away, launch his last journey. The raft takes on water. The process of disintegration has already begun. I stand here with cold circles around my ankles. A clump of blue feathers darkens, then sinks. My hand cups a ripple. This poem is simply called After an Ultrasound. After an ultrasound. I find myself down the back field, surveying the flora at my toes. Beige and purple clover blossoms and violet helals or woundwort among the green asterisks of dandelion, and near the white flecks of yarrow, a fragile trefoil I identify later, reverse image search on my phone, and more familiar yellows of buttercups and daisy hearts, and knocking gently against my shins, the stooping black heads of the ribwort plantain, a wildflower once used to bring back the dead. And I think of how as children, we just called it all grass. The next poem is called 4 Attempts at Making a Human. And as Rosamund mentioned, there's a film version of this that you can find online, thanks to my brother Jonathan, who's a visual artist based in Belfast. The poem is partially inspired by a book called The Popol Vuh, which is a sort of Maya, Guatemalan Maya creation book about how the gods made humans. And they had to go through a few attempts. They tried to make humans from mud or clay. That didn't work out. They tried wood, and they finally were successful when they used corn, maize. And so that was the inspiration partially for this poem. 4 attempts at making a human, and it's in 3 parts. 1. This is what happened. We made a small person out of mud and placed it down there on the table. Just like the gods, heart of sky, we rolled up our sleeves, heart of sea, to get our hands dirty in the stuff of life. But something went wrong. Its neck wouldn't turn. It just stared up at us, a tiny face with no understanding, a barely pulsating thing it couldn't think. Like an overcooked vegetable it couldn't worship, a sort of primal gurgle of lamentation as it dissolved in hot droplets into nothing. 2. There's an old joke about the car made out of wood. Wooden engine and dashboard, wooden wheels. The only problem? It wouldn't start. Something similar here. You see, we are chiseled, framed and shaped in the mouths of our peers, remembered by tongue. And so we did it again. We made a small person, a wooden effigy, and gave it some words. She crawled briefly before stopping, spoke eloquently until her face dried up into a kind of expressionless, desiccated mask. Her arms and legs turned stiff. An unresponsive little body, rigid and cold. No blood flowed within, no oil or sweat. We remembered stories of similar cases, effigy corpses left to be devoured, mouths and faces ruined and crushed, twig bones snapped, ground up for the dogs. And so we kissed her goodbye and submerged the crumbling husk in an organic and fragrant resin before burning. We inhaled the smoke, smeared the ashes on our arms and chests as the whole earth darkened in a thick black rain. And that was that. To remind me of our little wood girl experiment, I keep a single splinter ingrained, a speck I carry with me in the palm of my hand. 3. My darling wife. We've never been gods. Can't make corn into anything but food. And so it took us a 4th attempt. No, I'll not mention the 3rd. For the expected shock, a flush of rose water in the middle of breakfast. We wove our wildflowers into a sun. A filigree of bog cotton, mouse ear, mayweed, bedstraw, bittercress dampened with sea foam, eyebright and yarrow strengthened with dried strips of henequen. And he was born and lived and grew. So I'll just end with a short poem. And it's another one that I've sort of dragged, if not kicking, then screaming across the Atlantic. It's a sort of translation of an old Aztec Nahuatl poem called Nonancin. And the word Nonancin means mother, but it's the diminutive form of the word. And so I've rendered it as Mami. And I've changed it, I've tweaked it a bit to make it sound a bit more Irish than your average Nahuatl grief poem might sound. So here it is. Mami, Nonancin. Please, Mami, when I die, bury me under the kiln. And when you're baking the bread, you can cry for me there. If a passerby asks, Mrs., why all the tears? Say the firewood's still damp and the smoke hurts your eyes. So thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure, really enjoying this. And as I said, all these poems are from my book, Let the Dead, available from Banshee Press. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dylan. It was so brilliant to hear you read. That was absolutely gorgeous. So next, I'm delighted to say we have Jo Clement to join us. Jo Clement is managing editor of Butcher's Dog Poetry magazine, Newcastle. She lectures creative writing at Northumbria University. And in 2012, she was selected by New Writing North and Paul Farley for a Northern Writers Award. Outlandish, published by Blood Axe Books, a collection which, in part, is a tribute to her Roma family, was shortlisted for the John Pollard International Poetry Prize and longlisted for the Michael Murphy Memorial Poetry Prize. In her introduction to Outlandish, Clement says her poems draw from the past and present to confront and challenge damaging perceptions, while holding space to embrace those cultural traditions and practices that serve to make us who we are. Using highly visual, lyrical language, Clement's poems achieve this balancing act, turning praise into a form of protest and refusing to allow the richness of a threatened culture to go unsung. So I'm delighted you could join us today, Jo. You're very welcome.
Thank you, Rosamund. Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be reading here for Dún Laoghaire with Dylan and Sarah. And I suppose it feels a bit out of step to say this now, given the gravitas and the beauty of what we've just been hearing. But this is the sort of Eurovision bit where I tell you that I'm going to be joining you from Newcastle in England. I live by the coast in North Shields, and so if you can hear a kind of roaring, sorry to say it's not the sea, it's probably just a bus going by. So while it's still quiet, let's start with a poem. I'm going to read from Outlandish. I'll start with a poem called Fetlock. A fetlock is the sort of hinge or the joint that sits just above a horse's hoof. Fetlock. Say that Eden was elbowed out by the hill's bones. Say she followed his ghost here. Say any fool can pitch a small blue tent. Say not everything is sleeping. Say they wait for her torch to give out to the night. Say the scrape of frogs wakes her. Say the walls wear the luminous shadows of legs. Say they ride roughshod over her. Say her tent is a trembling bruise on the grass. Say this is how horses are foaled. And the poems in this book are really concerned with trespass. Half of England is owned by less than 1% of the population, and that less than 1% have not only privatised the majority of the land, they're also making it illegal and have made it illegal for the public to move through the majority of it. The right to roam has been compromised with the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which has made it illegal in particular for Gypsy, Roma and Traveller people to live on the road. So let's have two poems that speak to that. Crown. These are the standing stones, and what feet they have known to crown Yetham's kings and queens. No plaque marks the place, they define themselves, keeping oaths given to the wind, smoked peat blue as turf that knew no border. Off and on, they'd take your ears for using the wrong tongue, so we held them, dear as bairns to the breast, sharp as ground knives. At Stob Stain, Spey has me by the throat as I step up to hear the common. And the next poem I'm going to read is called Shoed. I was worried about there being an expletive in this one, but I'm not so worried now. Shoed. Tonight's flung open like a window, the grass littered with slivers of hoof the farrier's hand shears loose, scythes to shoe the passing flock. Appleby would shoe us too, if it could. The locals draw curtains, bolt doors, shut up shop, take off quick as the keepers gave my wander onto private grounds the boot. I'd seen it in the paper. Wrath of Tippek's divorcee who's down to her last castle, the mail resolved I'd somehow mind. What a fucking state. Hollow halls, curtained walls, ramparts a millennium high, and where the feud you pick. Offshore toffs sold the NHS, sunk BHS, even tried to sell Blencathra, and there's no fight in you yet. We string our fiddles high to keep from their rain. When mains touch, our pitches are as tight as cramp to shiver such songs from ears, from fingers to ear bones. Confess. And Blencathra, which appears in that poem, it's a hill that's in the Lake District that's also called the Saddleback, and it's one of the most northerly in the district. And about 10 years ago, it went up for sale for, I think it was £1.7 million. Human beings are quite audacious, aren't we, that we believe that we could ever own such things. And yet the rich really do. So I guess the next poem I'll read, as we're in the Lake District, I'll read Larch next. So this is a poem that's based on the poet William Wordsworth, who didn't really enjoy there being larch trees introduced into the area where he lived. These trees come into beautiful orange leaves much quicker than the local trees do. And I was thinking of the movement of travellers kind of locally and globally when I wrote this. Larch. Uprooted from Carpathian crests, we burnish in the native green. Out of season, he mistrusts our sudden height, but can't convince the canopy. This company of outskirt trees, each conceding dirt or light to the other. He finds our fires as foreign as his gypsies, sheltered here, blanketed by walls to raise ringlets, wreaths of smoke given back to the silver sky that shakes with murmurations of winged pollen, far thunder. He begged us, stop sporing spectres, burnt beltane boughs to ward us off returning to the near dark. Listen low enough, you'll hear us, trailing needled shawls down the corpse road. Larch sisters, bewitching the fells even black, with a bloomery of cast iron tongues. Our feet forge ember passage, keep on overrunning these hills. I've read somewhere that Wordsworth had no sense of smell, so I guess colour was one of those senses where the volume was kind of turned up for him. A shorter poem now. I'm going to read this one for my friend Bernadette, who I'm thinking about very much at the moment. Call-bearer. When I followed Venus's wet skirt back into the water, it wrapped around me like the call she bore my grandad in and breathed. We of the black curl bear these tides. We swallow pearls. We swallow time. I was very much thinking of Barry McSweeney's Pearl when I was writing that, but also the summer walkers, who were ethnic travellers who lived in Scotland, pearl fishers who moved around the coasts. And I'm writing a little bit about them at the moment, but those poems are too kind of gritty and not pearlescent enough to read to you today. So I'll read something else instead. What should I do? I grew up on a council estate in Darlington, in a house, and this poem is about skipping school. It's called Teesdale erratics, and erratics are large stones or boulders that are kind of carried from one place to another by ice. And the error in erratics from Latin means to wander. Teesdale erratics. Overnight, they arrive in the gap between the prefabs, whose sides are dashed with pebbles and a sign swung on one screw, no ball games. 3 boulders are planted on the grassy path, earless skulls crowned in whitewash, 2 ton, like the chip the teacher pointed out on her shoulder, sent her off with a slap to the head. She comes here instead to fizz open pop as she sits on the middle one, listening for his quad's buzz up and down the Queen's Highway, the rider shirtless and at speed, without licence or helmet. And I realised as I read that it's probably called the King's Highway now, because any public road or right-of-way in England is owned, I think it's actually, in the whole of Britain, is owned by the monarch. So I might have to drop Charlie an email or two about the potholes in my street at the moment. And following on from that, let's go for a camp, a wild camp. I wrote this poem when I was on a walk with Damien Labar, who's a fellow traveller writer. Wild camp. To hell with the abbey, we found a place between the pebbles. Look, a heron by the edges, peripheral, flies over. So here we are, bivvied by the Tweed like two rocks. And yeah, I suppose the patriarchy won't have fucked off until we can stop talking about man hours, stag do's, and my pay matches yours. See the angler making his way down. He's rivered to his thighs, a shadow casting out lines into the darkness, the fish jumping for flies. Or perhaps it's when we no longer need to explain how two people might walk, talk, and sleep together like this without any such complication, or even write a poem without a gypsy in it. Oh no, it's too late. Listen, the birds are dying off. And I just want to say as well, what a privilege it's been to read here. I know here is in my home, but it's brilliant to have these readings be shared in the homes of your viewers. And this has been such an intimate way to read with each other. So thanks again, Rosamund. And I'm going to finish on a song. This is for my dad. This is for John Lawrence. Singing lesson. No free rides here. No summer holiday. Back when Mum couldn't afford tea, yet alone shoes for our never-ending feet, I riled her senseless for a hoss. That's how he said it. Hoss. Light as a skim, I couldn't shake it, the way I'd seen them shudder flies. I roped her into a lesson. The lass slapped me in a helmet, clipped me to the bridle, had me rising up and down, fairground, pink and prim. She kept saying, horse, equestrian, course. Told me to brush my hair and learn to speak. I only went once, cost a tenner. When Grandad came back, we took a rag and bone pace past the burnt-out offie, no entry signs and pylons. Had me up on a muddy cob, slow enough not to spook the traffic, down the road where they zipped sulkies through red lights. Years apart, my dad and his dad led this passage, a hand each to his muzzle, reconciled. Steady hoss this, son. The motion steadies me still, my forebears looking back as my ankles tap out this hoss's stride. Now the birds murmur his song. She's a bonny lass, can ride an oss, my bairn, our blood, our road. The motion steadies me still. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jo. It was so wonderful to hear your work, and I feel so privileged that I've been able to hear all of you in this space. So since we're all here, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask some questions about your work, or about poetry more broadly. I think I'm going to direct this question first to Sara. Which is, I drew on a quote from Barry Lopez when I was thinking about poetry, although he's a writer of kind of travel writing and climate writing, and he said, "One must live in the middle of contradiction, because if all contradiction were eliminated at once, life would collapse. There are simply no answers to some of the great pressing questions." I wanted to ask you if you feel that poetry gives you space to stop seeking answers, but to look at questions and contradictions themselves.
For sure, poetry, for me, is a way of putting things in juxtaposition and watching how they spark off each other, and also a way of understanding that life can be how you frame it. I mean, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's all in how you look at it. And I find writing the poetry, I tend towards the darker parts of life, but it gives me such joy to write it. And it's such a meaningful act for me in the midst of the horror of the world. If you look at it that way, it allows me to illuminate things that are beautiful. And even in sorrow, there's a lot of meaning and draws us together. So I don't know if that was a coherent answer.
No, absolutely. I think I feel a lot of that as well. Dylan, would you feel that that kind of juxtaposition is important in your work?
Well, yeah, I think that the word juxtaposition is very something I'm fascinated with, how things can spark up against each other. And like, I'm interested in the surrealists and Eisenstein. Of contradiction.
I think we lost your sound a little bit there, Dylan.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Sorry, well, I'm not sure at what point I cut out.
You were saying Eisenstein, and then
his sort of montage of putting together images that don't seem to connect and how they can produce new sparks of meaning. Mm-hmm. And this idea of contradiction is fascinating. I'm obsessed with this sort of the idea of the futility of preservation of things, like everything will go, and yet we must try to never forget, and sort of the futility of forgetting. You can't forget because things will always, the past will exert its power on the present. And so that's sort of futility of, you can't fully preserve, but you can never fully forget. That contradiction, that's where I find a lot of my interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you find that the past weighs very heavily on the present in your work, Jo?
Definitely. I mean, the Lopez quote, it really makes me think about, what the great pressing questions are. And I only ever really write to discover something new, or to put words to a certain sort of feeling, and to invite the reader to exchange in that experience. And I think a poem that doesn't kind of offer the opportunity for that exchange, it's not really a poem. It's kind of, bread with unsalted butter. It'll fill you up, but what did you learn? Where was the flavour? And I think my poems kind of flag histories, but also the value of those histories and learning from them now. About social mobility. We still have so much inequality in the world, and it's from centuries ago, because we're not learning. It's people who scrambled over weaker people to get where they wanted to be. And I think it's, a contradiction, I guess, that we're living in the 21st century, but there's people, dying in their homes. We've got medical marvels, but healthcare is being monetized, and the establishment sort of lets this happen. So I think poetry is a place where, those histories can be brought to account, held to account, and the people responsible for them. And good poetry, I think, should teach us the kind of practice of empathy. And I think the poems we've heard today have been really brilliant examples of that, bringing us into experience, and hopefully the readers will really join the poets on those journeys.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think the study of empathy is a really important part of poetry, and that all three of you are really excellent examples of that. So I think a theme that I was really noticing in all of your work was one of loss. And I was reading an essay recently by Jahan Ramazani, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, who says that loss, grief, mourning, death is indeed the mother of beauty, uniting poets of our time who have little else in common. I wanted to ask if you feel that a sense of mourning is in a lot of poetry you would read, and maybe to ask how you feel loss influences your own work. And I'm going to point that question towards Dylan first, because his collection is called Let the Dead.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think mourning and loss is has always been in poetry, really. So I don't know if it's there more now than it has been, but certainly it's very interesting to me. I've noticed recent poems of mourning connected to climate, and I think that's something that we're going to see a lot of, unfortunately, of course. There's a poem about the river by Natalie Diaz. The first water is the body, and it's magnificent, making connections between how climate and sort of culture and language are all intertwined, and we lose them all together. As for myself, yeah, for sure. It's, again, this idea of preservation and what poetry can do, and commemoration, and that's what's interesting me, how we honor what's gone, and how we choose to remember. The past tells us who we are in the present. We can see that what statues we want to knock down now and which ones we want to put up now. That tells us who we are at this moment and how we deal with the past and the things that we've lost. So yes, it's a constant focus for me in my work.
I can see that. I love the poem that you mentioned. I think it's about the Colorado River by Natalie Diaz. It's a wonderful exploration of how our connection to nature is felt in the body as well as intellectually. Jo, in your work, I really feel is a sense of sort of celebration that is always also goes hand in hand with loss. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think most of my poems are elegies, and the most kind of enduring and restorative thing about an elegy is that it emerges from the present, and in that way it can't kind of help but be an ode and to celebrate, because it's the speaker saying, I'm here now, I'm alive, and I remember. And I loved what Dylan was saying about that kind of sense of anticipatory grief that we hopefully kind of collectively have for climate and for the future of the planet. Because one of the questions that sort of springs up in my work in terms of elegy is what is being mourned. And there are lots of who in my poems that are mourned, lots of people, family who appear in the poems. And my dad was still alive while I was writing the book, but he was in palliative care for many, many years, just up until last year. And so I think that sense of like anticipating someone's passing really loomed large over the work. And there's certainly some poems that I can't read at the moment because it's too upsetting for me. But I think my poems also mourn other things, things that I didn't have to start with. Wealth, privilege, an orderly family, the kind of ease of life that so many people I've met in poetry kind of take for granted. And I think I'm kind of also mourning this assumed centre of whiteness, the highly educated place of comfort that I don't want to say like exclusively resists other cultures. In fact, it kind of actively cherry picks from other cultures and exploits them and profits from them. So I suppose outlandish is it's really mourning the hierarchies that are imposed upon us. And when I say highly educated as well, I don't just mean that as a compliment. Highly educated doesn't mean highly emphatic. I mean people that have been taught to repeat facts and repeat systems for their benefit, not really to feel real feelings or care about real people. So yeah, most of my poems are elegies, and to kind of circle back on the question, I don't think mourning is like a preoccupation for modern poetry. I think it's there, like Dylan said, throughout the history of writing poetry, and especially in oral poetry as well. So when we mourn in the past, we're querying, what it means to be alive now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that when we look at the past, we ask what it means to be here now. And Sarah, I really thought that the Last Cold Day is a book of questions about what it means to be here in this moment, as well as, and that this moment is one with a lot of mourning attached to it. How would you find that loss influenced the Last Cold Day?
Well, loss is such an ever-present thing in my life. Being a hospice nurse, it's my bread and butter 5 days a week, people losing everything. Death has always been a fascinating subject for me since I was a kid. I remember learning Stop All the Clocks by Auden by heart, because I thought it was a strong expression of grief, that nothing would ever be the same. And there's plenty to mourn in this world. Certainly we're losing all the time species and our way of life. But I think we always have, in some ways. There's always been a tremendous amount of loss that humans face. And I believe that part of the responsibility of a poet is to be celebratory about the things that we are losing. I loved Dylan's poem about the kingfisher, and that he kept it for so long, but eventually he set it free. And that's part, I feel, of the cathartic work of poetry, is to set yourself free from the grief that might pull you down. And certainly you could just read the morning news and not want to get out of bed, but there must be a way to rise above it and to celebrate loss, and to celebrate the fact that life is so brief and we're all headed in the same direction. We don't even know where we're going, but we live with that. I think it was the idea of the Buddhists, where you live each day as though it's going to be your last, with death looking over your shoulder. It is a way to concentrate the way that you live, and to be, as I said, celebratory that you're alive today.
Yeah, absolutely. And celebrating that you are here now, I think, is a really important thing. And I think that's also a really lovely place to end our discussion. I mean, it's always hard to wind these things up, because I feel like we could have some great conversations for a really long time. But I'm aware we have constraints as well. So I'd just like to say that this is the last Poetry at the Lexicon for 2023. And I'm so thrilled that I was able to have all three of you here today. I think it's been a fantastic reading. And thank you to everyone who listens, and to the libraries and Culture Ireland for making this possible. And also a huge thank you to Sara Berkeley, Dylan Brennan, and Jo Clement. So thank you, and we'll see you soon.